and welcome to Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and I like how stylish and efficient your light-up Velcro shoes are. You're about to hear the second part of this two-part episode on climate change. Yesterday I had on Jerry Taylor from the Niskanen Center, who is a market-oriented, individual rights type guy, but he also thinks global warming is happening, and that's a problem. For that reason, he endorses a carbon tax as a way to incentivize the market to move away from fossil fuels. Today, Stu Burguiere is going to join me in a moment to give me his perspective, which is more on the skeptical side, and then we are going to arm wrestle. But before we do either of those, we need to give a shout-out to this week's sponsor, carbonated whiskey from Glencavan Distillery. It's like the whiskey is screaming. You're an immortal warrior of Clan MacLeod from the Highlands of Scotland, and you can be killed only by decapitation. When you lop off the head of another immortal, your veins fill with the power of 1,000 lightning storms in the quickening. You were trained by the charismatic Spaniard Juan Sanchez Villalobos Ramirez. Both of you knew that if you lived long enough, you'd eventually have to face off in deadly combat, for there can be only one. But long before you even had to contemplate that dread melee, an evil Russian called the Kurgan killed your friend and mentor first. It's been 40 years since that fateful day when the Kurgan attacked your wife Heather, killed your friend, and burned down your house. You have not aged at all. But Heather has. Her hair is gray, her left eye is the faint gauze of a cataract, and her fingers are gnarled. She traces one finger against your face. "You haven't changed," she says. You nod. "I suppose not." 40 years, she says. 40 years. And you still won't clean your dishes when you're through with them. You just stack them in the sink. You haven't changed at all. "They need to soak," you say for the 1,000th time. "That makes it easier to clean them later. They gotta soak." "Later," she snorts. "No, it doesn't. It makes them easier to forget about. So I have to do it. You're outside getting drunk and playing caber toss with your degenerate mates, and I'm inside cleaning up your dishes." "Listen, can we talk about this later?" you ask. "I had a rough day at work." "Fine," she says. "Fine. Let's talk about the last time you took me dancing. We haven't been to a ceilidh in 15 years. She prattles on, and you think, my God, how much longer is this crone going to keep clinging to life? I'm too conflict-averse for a divorce. I figured I'd just run out the clock on this awful marriage, white-knuckle it for 3 or 4 decades tops, then bury the old lady and snap up some co-ed nursing school." "Oh, it's raining again," she says. "Do you know how I know it's raining? Because I can feel it dripping down on me from our mouldy thatched roof. Maybe some of your degenerate neds you tossed cabers around with can sober up long enough to plug our roof. It's like we live under a big rotting sponge, that roof." She keeps squawking, and you pour yourself 6 fingers of whiskey just to keep yourself level. You grimace from the sheer, unmitigated flatness of it, unable to choke it down, and so you pour it down the sink. "Hey, wait a minute," you say, dead sober. "Is today our anniversary?" "Oh, aye, did you remember that?" she says. "Did you go out and gather thistle for me? No." "Wait, which anniversary is it, woman?" you ask. "It's our 85th wedding anniversary," she spits. "Wait, did we get married in our 30s? Aye." And that's when it hits you. Your wife is also immortal, and you're trapped in this marriage forever. Looks like you could use a stiff glass of carbonated whiskey. Triple malt carbonated whiskey, distilled in scenic Hoyk, Scotland, is the only scotch on the market with all the romantic heraldry of Scotland, yet the ebullient bubbliness of gas station Diet Coke. Carbonated whiskey from Glencavan Distillery. It's like the whiskey is screaming. Now it's time for another installment of How To with Heaton. Today, how to water plants. So you would think it'd be easy to keep track of watering all the plants I have. What with the abundance of free time I have at night. Every night. But actually, I have several dozen plants, each of which requires their own specific watering regime. If they don't get the basic sustenance they need, the plants will wither away and die. And no one will ever know or care. They'll just cease to be. Succulents, like cactuses, need the least amount of water. You can pretty much just abandon them, and they'll be fine with or without you. They'll fend for themselves. Just dribble a little water on a cactus every couple of months, like they're street beggars before the French Revolution. Life has kicked the average cactus down so hard it'll take whatever it can get. A succulent will gladly accept inattention because inattention is ultimately just a reprieve from the monsters who populate this hellscape we call life. Conversely, liverworts and hornworts need constant watering because of their undeveloped vascular systems. Pretty much every night you should water those things. Just stand over them with a watering can thinking, well, I guess this is the level of responsibility I've peaked at, taking care of a pet salad. Over by your window, you probably have some flowering plants. Those aren't as thirsty as liverworts, probably because they're happier. Like ballerinas frozen in time, just enjoying each other's company, smiling at the sun. You know who's not thinking about the cactus? Flowers. Way too busy being flowers to think about non-flowers. Flowers are having brunch with other flowers. That's what flowers are doing. Now, a lot of people will put a finger down in the soil to see if it's dry. The problem with that is if the topsoil dries out first, the roots might still be wet. A way to gauge things is to slide a chopstick down between the pot and the soil and then withdraw it to see if it's damp at the bottom. So whenever you order Chinese food, go ahead and lie to Ming's China Palace and say it's dinner for two. You can keep the extra chopsticks to test plants with, and also trick the Chinese into thinking you don't eat by yourself every night. And of course, chopsticks are just easier to clean. You leave 2 forks in a sink for 3 or 4 months, they rust. Pretty soon, you don't have a sink, you just have a basin full of rusty shrapnel. Not so with chopsticks. Although, of course, chopsticks are made of wood from trees, so it's kind of like you're testing the soil of a plant using another plant's skeleton, which would be terrifying, I guess, if they could still feel anything. Finally, remember that if you cry a lot, your tears are saline, and salt water is the last thing a plant needs. So just sob in the shower with the lights off, drinking box wine straight out of the spigot like a normal person. And that's how you water a plant. My guest today is Stu Burguiere. He is the co-host on The Glenn Beck Show. He's a regular on the news and why it matters. And he's my friend.
Oh,
thanks for coming on, Stu.
Thank you, Andrew. Very nice to be here.
Yeah. So yesterday we had on Jerry Taylor. We talked about global warming, and we talked about his preferred policy, which is a carbon tax. And I'm pretty much in his camp on this one. I think it's happening. I think that we're contributing to it, and I see a role for government in it. What I would like to see happen alongside that is I wish that conservatives and libertarians would kind of step up to the table more frequently, because I see a lot of bad arguments coming out of a lot of bad policy positions coming out of our progressive friends that I think should be called for it. And I also think that conservatives and libertarians tend to appreciate the innovative side of climate change policy a little bit more. The economy is likely to breed good things, so we don't want to strangle that.
Yes.
And so that's kind of where my head's at. But I think in our prior conversations, when we've talked about global warming on the news and why it matters, I don't know that I'd call you a climate skeptic. You do seem far more placid than I am. So I wanted to bring you on to have kind of the lower blood pressure perspective on this so we could talk about it. So do you think global warming's happening, and do you think we're contributing to it? I
would say my best understanding of it, and my best, I don't want to say my best guess, but I think the answer to that is yes, right? Okay. I think it is happening. I don't think there's anybody who, even the hardcore climate skeptic would admit that we have warmed over the past 100 years, about 0.9 degrees Celsius. There's a decent margin of error built into that number, but we understand that there's been warming. Yeah. Are we contributing? I think the answer to that is yes. The question probably is, and I think this is where the debate largely lies these days, is to what level. We obviously, the IPCC will tell us that it's, it doesn't say it's all human activity that is changing the climate, but it does say the majority of it is due to humans. So it's a significant factor, although the majority is it's a big, window there. When from 51 to 100% is a relatively large window and would make a massive change on how we decide policy as it relates to it. I do think that it is a situation that has to be looked at from a pretty large perspective, and I think my largest issue with many of the situations related to global warming is going to be more on how to deal with it. Gotcha. And what is the most effective way to deal with it. I mean, I don't. I'm not gonna. I don't have a hoax T-shirt on right now. I mean, I would.
You might. I'll go ahead and put on plaid for Heaton's show, but then rip it off when you get back to your room.
That's how I'm going to
light a cigar with some methane or whatever.
And I think that's part of the issue here with this. And I really appreciate what you're doing here over the last couple of shows, because you're having a civil conversation among two kind of different viewpoints, and also your representative from the other side isn't some crazy person, right? Like and you're not.
Sure, Stu.
Now I may be the crazy person on this side, so
I told Jennings I need to get a crazy person, and he was like, "Well, Stu's in the building. We can just rope Stu in." I went, "Yeah, great. That sounds awesome."
Because I think that hoax is not necessarily helpful. It's also not necessarily describing what people are saying, right? And I think the same thing goes with the word like deniers. I think hoax and deniers are completely on a very similar level. I'm not denying anything is going on with the climate, and I don't think that most people who are skeptical of the climate believe it's a hoax. There are people who I think it's a shorthand for a very long, nuanced political argument that is unfortunate, and also most people don't feel like diving into, right? I mean, it's not the sexiest topic.
Yeah, I find that very rarely if I'm out having drinks with comedians and we're going to get into politics, I'm like, oh boy, let me sit down and tell you about my revenue neutral carbon tax with rebates to the they're like, no, we don't want to talk about the actual white papers, Heaton. We just want to argue about who's a moron. Yeah. I'm like, well, that's not really my thing.
And I think it is not a positive for the actual outcomes here for people, to call the others, I would disagree with a lot of people on the climate. To call me a denier, I think is unfair. I think to say, the scientists are committing some giant hoax to fool people is also completely ridiculous. I mean, I think that the sort of hoax idea is basically a shorthand for saying, look, we're maybe not as sure as we think we are. The solutions that are being presented are highly questionable. And in addition to that, there are some people who I think are using that topic to advance other motives.
I agree with you there. And they're not making my life any easier. So because I've been saying this it's interesting. Actually, let me back up a little bit. If you were to give a lay of the land of, say, like the conservative kind of or right-wing spectrum, what would to what percent would you say that people are largely falling into your category of this is happening, but I'm not sure about the solution, as opposed to it's a hoax?
Let me answer that with an anecdote that I've noticed. Over the years, one of my roles on the show and in my own show and all over the place has been kind of the climate nerd guy. I like numbers. I like reading boring government reports. I like these things. And so I get stuck.
When you and I hang out, we just go to the dressing room and read math.
Yes,
we sit there and read math quietly.
I will say, after doing it for a while, I would say that it's not particularly interesting to the audience. And I hate to say that in the middle of a show, which you're trying to do to an audience, but it is like, I really do.
We had comedy up top. They're fine. We already did the thing about watering plants.
Okay. They got the carbonated whiskey. That was already done. Yeah. It's okay. Because I think it's not the most interesting pressing topic. If you look at a list of priorities when polled, Americans almost exclusively find it in last or second to last place.
It tends to be feeding ourselves, getting a job, and healthcare tend to be the top three things in polls.
Exactly. And then there's a lot of other stuff, like what's the new product from Taco Bell is like 14th, and then like 22nd is global warming. And that includes Democrats. I mean, it's a low priority for Democrats. So there is this is it's a business. People, they want those urgent issues that are on the top of their brain. And global warming, really, Al Gore comes out and says something that's maybe a little controversial here and there, and we dive into it, but it's not something that necessarily there's a thirst for a huge nuanced conversation. And I would say the same thing is true on the left. They don't want to hear anything, in most cases, that describes something where they're not getting giant controls of the economy. And that's why it's easy to, I think, correctly assess their motivation as not being exactly pure.
And that's the frustrating thing for me, because for the last several years, I was working at Fox Business, and I was definitely more concerned about global warming and climate change than a lot of the people there were. And I would get myself into these conversations where I'm like, guys, this isn't a hoax. No one's trying to use global warming as a means to seize the global economy. It's just scientists agreeing. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez goes, hey, you know what? We can further social justice by taking over the whole economy and also something plants.
Yes.
And I went, no, you're really making it difficult for me to advance this in my whole sector.
Because I think, and no offense, of course, here, but I think your statement, as you stated it there, is wrong. I think there are a lot of people who are actually looking to use the climate. That's not the scientists, though.
Yeah.
And that's an important distinction. I try to make it to conservatives often, and that, like, look, there are a lot of people who, just like income inequality or racism or sexism or transphobia or Islamophobia, will grab onto an issue that in some places is an actual real issue, right? And sometimes not, and try to use that to their advantage. It's this idea of creating kind of a state of constant war, right? We all know in World War II, we all came together. We'll do anything. We'll give up anything to stop what's going on with the Nazis. Or it's trying to create that, and that happens also on the right, but it is sensible to detect it on the left as well. And with this issue, I think is a great example of it. I mean, if you look at, Glenn famously was put in the doom room by Stephen Colbert because all he was doing was, thinking constantly about apocalypse. And Glenn's predicted a lot of really bad things, some of which have actually come true. I don't know if anyone's noticed the caliphate was a thing, and we did have an economic collapse in 2008 and 2009. But there is no bigger prediction of imminent catastrophe than one tied to this topic, global warming. I mean, we're talking about literally the entire world and everyone on it going away in some catastrophic situation. And so I think there is a healthy pushback on that from the right. The idea that this sort of excesses of claims when it comes to global warming is a rational thing to push back on. And it's also a lot easier, right, than going in and diving into each one of these IPCC reports.
Am I right in thinking then that you do not have a problem with the scientific consensus that global warming is happening and it's Anthropocene, but that where your ire is drawn is rather at the solutions proposed to deal with it?
I yes, with a caveat. Okay. So let me give you the caveat. I think we have to be careful in the level of certainty we apply to how wonderfully brilliant we are today. At no other point in history did we have everything locked down scientifically. And when we do lock things down scientifically, it tends to go through a very basic process, right? Like you're able to come up when you have a controlled experiment. That experiment gives you some sort of result. Maybe before that, you even have an observational study of some sort, but it gives you advance that to a place, okay, let's do this under a controlled circumstance. You get the controlled circumstance, that comes out, you get the result. Then other people are able to replicate that result over and over and over again. This is not the fault of scientists in the case of global warming. They just don't have thousands of globes to with the exact climate specifications that we have and the same conditions. The way they've tried to replicate this, as we know, is with climate models, right? Like they've tried to basically say, okay, now we do have 1 million globes and we can do this and we can turn this lever up and watch the change over a period of time and try to understand that. I think it's, at no other point in history have we been able to be comfortable with something I think that complicated and nailed that way. It's, we saw it with the financial markets, for example. I mean, we've got incredible incentives to be able to understand when a crash is coming, and study after study after study shows that no one can do it. No one can predict better than the generic market. All of that brain power, every graduate from every financial institution in the world, and still not able to really nail that. Now, there's slight differences, right? You're talking about human behavior versus...
You got spirit animals or whatever that is,
right?
So bulls and bears.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But I mean, I think I'm concerned with the level of certainty. Deniers is an easy way to talk about this. The idea that the Holocaust occurred, there's no way that scientists today are as sure as that as they are with global warming and all of the effects associated. These are very complicated systems.
Well, hold on, I just want to make sure I grasp that. You're saying that we can be more confident that the Holocaust occurred than that global warming is happening? Did I say that backwards?
I hope not.
I just want to make sure I got that right. Because if you're the Holocaust, I want to be very clear.
I'm 100% Holocaust occurred. I'm on that camp.
You're not skeptical of that.
Right. And I think I am willing to accept, okay, this is what we think is the right this is what we believe is correct now for the climate. It's the best assessment that we have, and scientists are doing honest work to come to that conclusion.
Okay.
On the other hand, we have to admit that these things are not as sure as we believe they are. And so would we be surprised if instead of 75% man-made, that it's 30%? Well, I would not be surprised at all if that were true. And if that were true, it's a massive difference in the way we're thinking about this issue. So like if you think about I was talking about the climate models for a second there. If you think of, this is a very complicated system that you're trying to replicate essentially through a computer to say, okay, we're going to change this, we're going to change CO2 to this level and methane's going to go to this level and that's going to give us this result. Let me give an example of another real world here where we have billions of people, right, that we are essentially experimenting on all the time. Doctors are looking at, okay, this person came up with this disease. How do we fix that, right? We have these medications. How do we come up with these solutions? And we still are very early in our understanding, and we actually can see full life cycles of these human beings, right? We can do certain things. This person eats lots of, carbonated whiskey, drinks. This person drinks, only eats at Snuffies. Like we can see and we can detect these things over long periods. Over long periods of time.
Fun, healthy people.
What are the health benefits or maybe negatives of dining with horses all the time, right? Like I don't know what they are, and we can study that. So to kind of go through and the fact that you see how early we are still in being able to understand the human body and being able to cure specific diseases and the way they develop, there have been many things we have solved. And I think that it shows we can get there, but it is a long slog, and with no ability to actually experiment, I think you have to admit at least some level of uncertainty. And I don't think that that's often admitted.
Well, I'm okay with that. Mm-hmm. I'm okay with, and I think the kind of the basic premise to the scientific revolution was the idea that we don't believe in authority-based knowledge.
Yeah.
That it has to, So I'm fine with skepticism existing, and I think it's very healthy. However, is there a level of Are you able to get past that to go into policy prescriptions?
Totally.
Or is it?
I just wanted to make that distinction.
Okay.
Because there's a difference between we know and this is the best we have with the knowledge at our time. And I think that distinction among people who are usually pushing for global warming government intervention, that it's not admitted. It's like, we've had times in the 1900s, we thought we knew what the environmental problems were going to be too, and they were horses pooping in the streets of New York City. How are we going to remove all this manure?
I should note, though, that as far as I can tell, in terms of having a scientific consensus, we're about as close as we can get in terms of Anthropocene. It's like, of the scientists in the field, it's like 97% say we're causing it, and they're all worried.
I would definitely, I would have issues with the 97% number. We can do that another day.
Okay.
However, there is a difference between saying global. There's levels of this, right? It has the globe warmed, basically 100%. I don't even have to go to 97. Yeah. Is man contributing to it? I think it's close to. It's in the. It depends on how you measure that, but there's a high percentage of that too. I'm fine with that. Go beyond that. Is it going to be catastrophic? Well, you're starting to drop things off. Yeah. What is the right solution to it? That you're really dropping off. And I think the issue is everything short of Al Gore's fever dream is treated as denial. And I think, honestly, it would be more effective for people. It would be easier for me to convince people on the right to say, look, there is some science here that I think is interesting and we should look at and understand and maybe motivate some of our future decisions. It would be easier to get people there if the constant certainty and alarm was not present.
Okay.
And I know that's not what you're doing. It's not what your guest was doing yesterday, but I think it is it's an important distinction as it relates to this conversation.
Sure. Okay. Well, noting that then, is there sufficient enough scientific consensus for you to want to make policy prescriptions to deal with global warming, or are you locked in an agnostic state?
I'm not. I think it would be beneficial for us to, when plausible and feasible economically, to pursue technological innovation to this end. And I think we're getting a lot of that, honestly. I think a lot of that's happening. When it comes to sort of big government intervention into this, I would be opposed to it. I know you mentioned being for a carbon tax, and we can kind of go into that more if you want as well. I would not favor that policy.
Yeah, we're going to fight. Hold on. So before we start fighting, I want to throw it because I think something that I appreciate the Matt Ridleys of the world. We were talking about him earlier, where a glimmer of hope that I have in this field, and that I don't want to be strangled by draconian measures, is innovation. So we're at the point now where a lot of the policies I look at, it's like we got to tighten the belt, we got to cut back, and I'm like, well, okay, but there's a threshold at which it doesn't matter anymore anyway, because there's 1 billion people in China, and there's about to be 1 billion people in India, and they want air conditioners and they want Buicks, and so anything we do has to take into account about 2 billion people that are going to be moving. So it needs to be innovation that's going to help them out. That we need to figure out a way to have a good air conditioner and a streamlined Buick. And then the thing Ridley brings up that I am optimistic about is the IPCC panels that are kind of they're the lodestone for climate change. I think that's kind of the main thing most people are citing. They're all predicated on the idea that the second and third world are going to keep developing. And when you get into those models, it's built in that the globe is going to keep getting more wealthy, and that all of these people that are currently shoveling cow dung and lighting fires in their hut are going to go get to have decent jobs.
I hope that's true.
Which is a great thing. And I look at that and I'm like, there have to be thousands of Steve Jobses. I don't know what the plural of Jobs is. Job size? Jobtopus?
Jobs.
There's got to be thousands of Steve Jobs that are currently right now just subsisting and barely alive. And if we could get them into it, we kind of have this view that we're the only ones involved in this. And I think that if you unlock that bottom third of the globe and get them into the first world economy, there's going to be solutions coming out of Nigeria that we wouldn't have thought of that we can now do because they're involved in it. So I don't want to do anything that keeps those people in perpetual poverty. And I also think it's beneficial for us to get them out of perpetual poverty, both from an economic model and from a climate model.
And morally.
So I don't want to, and this is where we get into the policy realm. A lot of the time, some of the things I hear from progressives are so intense, so draconian, and so overwhelming that I am afraid they're going to strangle that innovation, and that's going to leave us worse off from a climate model, but also all those people are going to stay poor, which is why I want conservatives and libertarians to step up and go, hey, but here's a good idea.
Yes, and you mentioned this when we talked about this earlier, that you want them involved in the debate, and I totally agree in the debate. I don't necessarily want to cede the ground of there must be government intervention, so therefore they must be at the table designing government policy. I mean, I want them there, but I generally want them to be saying no to things.
Sure.
And maybe encouraging things that would free these innovations up. I mean, I think a lot of times the skeptical side, let's just call it that, gets portrayed as anti-science when, I think I have more faith in science than anyone else. I really legitimately believe that these things are going to occur when it comes to innovations that are going to solve this problem. And I also legitimately and sincerely believe that adaptation is a real way to deal with the things that we may not see coming, or we may see coming that are worse than we currently believe. This is how we usually deal with things. And, the only way I think you can get past that as an argument is to get to this point where we're kind of in this positive feedback loop where these things, the climate just screams out of control and we can't even innovate at the pace to handle it or to deal with it.
So we're both on team innovation. Innovation's good.
Okay.
And we're both on team, let's help the globe get rich, right? We want everybody to get out of subsistence farming, right?
Yes.
So noting that, are there policies in the United States that you would want to see enacted?
I would not like to see, so I'm starting with a no, which is government intervention into this situation at all. At all. I do not believe that government is the solution, and I can give you a bunch of different reasons why. I think you can kind of look at, you mentioned China, and it's an interesting example, but when you mention draconian laws, you're right in that would not work, right? Like we would force people to not innovate. We would hurt them. We would hurt their ability to survive, and not only is that a bad idea, it's completely immoral, I think, to do that to someone. So the Green New Deal to me is the type of thing that is completely off the table, and I know it's off the table.
Yeah, and then also I have to touch on this real quick. The fact that it just out the gate, no nuclear power. Like the largest carbon emission, or the largest greenhouse gases coming out of the United States, it comes primarily from transportation. If you were to have electric cars and a nuclear power grid, right there, boom, we've just pole vaulted beyond the current level, and out of the gate, they're like, nope, not nuclear power, because that's evil electricity.
Yeah,
you can only have holy electricity that comes from these specific types of renewable things, because at that point, we're really having a religious argument instead of an actual policy argument.
See, this is you're uncorking a very negative thing here, in that no one wants to hear me talk about this crap, so I always have to, and now you're launching off tirades here.
Yeah.
So first of all, again, this is a very friendly, nuanced conversation we're having, and I'm trying to be respectful to not only you, but also your guest yesterday and anyone who happens to be on your side of this. So I'm trying to state these things as nicely as possible. But like, I have almost no tolerance whatsoever for a person who talks to me about global warming and opposes nuclear energy.
I agree with you.
It's just insane, right? Like,
it's not, because you're not serious at that point, and you're making a spiritual argument now.
Exactly. You can't make a science-based argument with me where you're like, oh, nuclear energy is really bad, when there's no evidence of this whatsoever. France is powering 80% of its country on nuclear power. We've had basically, even when you look at Chernobyl, go to Chernobyl, which is the only time that there's really been any massive negative impact of nuclear accidents. Today there's a book called Physics for Future Presidents, which is worth a read. I think you'd enjoy it. But they go through.
I plan to be a future president.
There you go. Yeah, I suppose you should know this stuff. Yeah. It's basically written from the perspective of, hey, I'm a science advisor for a president. You should understand. And what he writes in there, I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head, but that actually it wasn't even obvious policy in retrospect to evacuate the area. That's how minimal the actual impact was of Chernobyl. They had real negative consequences of that, taking all those people out of that area, taking them out of their homes. Making a mandatory evacuation was not actually cost-benefit analysis-wise not necessarily the right thing to do. And again, that's freaking Chernobyl. This is the USSR putting up like a chain link fence around a reactor, right? Like, this is a terrible. We don't do anything like that. We have not been able to innovate in this area.
3 Mile Island was, in my opinion, a success story, in that we were able to shut it down before something terrible came. Fukushima.
Yep, same thing.
It wasn't a reactor breakdown. We got flooded. Okay, don't build it in a flood zone.
Yeah, and
lesson learned.
And also, no one died from it. That's a whole other. Yeah. Lots of people died from the giant wave.
Yeah,
but no one died.
Thanks, Mother Nature.
Yeah, I know. Thanks a lot. So Michael Schnellenberger is a guy who he did a whole documentary on this. He's from the left, very left-wing guy, very big believer in climate change, but also a guy who believes in nuclear power as a solution. And it's like, okay, you've hit the realm where I can take you seriously when that goes on.
Right.
Because at least you're saying, because, part of this innovation talk is like, we should come up with a magical source of energy that doesn't cost anything, that doesn't, consume natural resources and doesn't emit anything, and it'll last forever. If we ever come up with that, then it'll be amazing. But of course, we have come up with that, and it's nuclear power.
And to quote Thomas Sowell, who should, I think, be quoted in literally every environmental policy conversation, environmentalism is not about solutions; it's about trade-offs. So, what do we want? Well, we want to have clean electricity that doesn't pollute the atmosphere. That if you stand downwind of it, you're not going to get cancer, and it's not going to increase global carbon. Great. The trade-off is that you get a few buckets of radioactive rocks that you've got to hide inside of a mountain. But there's literally
it's a really
nothing.
Good deal.
Yeah, there's nothing if you want to build if you want to make solar power, you still have to get the metal out of the ground. Yeah, and it might be a good thing to do, but like there's no 100% model. It's all going to be what's the best outcome, best thing. So here's
I just want one other thing, because we were in the middle of talking about, if you don't mind, I don't mean to derail your program here. But when it comes,
this is the rant portion. We allot the 25-minute mark. Is
no
the
one wants to
portion,
hear this percentage talk other than you, so I'm going to give it to you. So the U.S. is about 15% of global emissions. Okay, that's what the U.S. consists of. Actually, in transportation, the entire transportation sector is about 29% of U.S. emissions. So if you were to think about draconian policy, think about some policy, whatever you think it is, that magically can create turning off the entire transportation sector. It's not something we could ever achieve. Right, like this is something that it's a completely ridiculous idea. It is Green New Deal banning cars. Right, you are going to 0% total emissions from the transportation sector. Not realistic, but for the sake of argument, let's just say that it is. You'd cut global emissions by about 4.3%. By turning off the number one world economy and their entire transportation sector. Now, if you just go and say, okay, well, you're going to save that, and you're going to save, global emissions, you're going to save a couple of percent of global emissions, you have to realize that all of these other countries are doing the same thing. Even when you take out China, you take out India, you take out the EU, you take out the United States. I mean, if you group all the other countries, which are all developing at some level along, you're going to outdo all of those savings within a year or two. Because they are, of course, coming online. And these are all things we should be cheering for, and as we've discussed, not opposing. As we've heard many quotes from environmentalists over the years who will say, basically, we can't allow these third world nations to get to these levels of development or we're screwed. And I think that is a purely evil way of thinking about it. I know I'm trying to do some sort of nuance here, but on that one, I really feel strongly about it.
I think keeping people in perpetual poverty, although I must swing here, most of my Democrat friends would not say that. I think there are there are people, but I don't believe that that's the dominant argument.
Totally understand and agree for sure. But again, there are trade-offs there when you're using more expensive forms of electricity. You are necessarily making it more difficult for people in, especially resource-rich countries like Nigeria. You're really putting them in an issue where they are going to have a tough time dealing with solar panels all over the place. But again, nuclear power is a really great solution to a lot of these things, and I think could be a part of it. So I just wanted to at least hit that because I think it's important to understand, the things that it's one thing to talk about policy in this larger sense, which I think is important and productive. Things like you should buy a Prius, things like you should unplug your your plugs from your walls when you go out. They might be nice for you to save a few dollars on your electricity or a few dollars on gas, but literally make zero impact. It's a statement on who you are, right? It's almost a way of buying into a club. Like you feel like you're doing something, and we should be honest that we're not.
And this is one of the reasons that I want libertarians and conservatives part of this debate, because I consider myself an environmentalist, and by that I mean this: I care about the earth. And I do things to help it. I've volunteered at a bunch of different locations this last year. I donate to the Jane Goodall Foundation. I am making an active, proactive contribution to the earth. When I say environmentalist, I don't mean that I like Captain Planet on Facebook.
Right.
And I have found a lot of people like that. I think it's. I'll try not to go down a complete rabbit hole, but I think it takes on a religious dimension where I think. Maybe call it ecoism instead of environmentalism. It strikes me as sort of Calvinism minus Jesus plus Captain Planet. It's this: people are bad, you should feel bad, you should feel guilty, but you can kind of alleviate that by recycling, which basically does nothing.
It's sometimes negative.
Because like if you're in Wyoming or something, or I don't remember the exact location, but there are a couple of states where they have to ship all of the stuff to another state, and it actually creates more carbon.
And tons of it goes
because,
to
again,
China
we're talking about
to be done until recently when they stopped doing it, and we're in a massive problem with recycling because of that.
So, but that's one of those things where it's like I get the impulse to do something, but you need to be clear on whether or not that impulse is helping. And most of the time, recycling is about net neutral, if not worse.
Yes, and it's certainly worse without the infrastructure. Like at the beginning, there was no question it was worse. Like once you build all the train tracks and you have all the infrastructure, putting a train on it is you're factoring in a lower cost, right? But you don't build new train tracks now, right? Like it makes no sense financially or any other way. So it's the same thing here.
I'll say I think there's a psychologically negative attribute to it in that if you're like, I'm an environmentalist, I like Captain Planet on Facebook, and I recycle, I'm done.
Yeah, it makes you feel like you've accomplished something.
You haven't done anything, and in fact, that energy should have gone elsewhere.
Yeah, and one last point on that, I think that's why I think some of the work of the Copenhagen Consensus with Bjorn Lomborg's group of prioritizing and just being honest about it. Look, we have a certain amount of money and we want to spend it on some things. Well, let's get a bunch of the best economists in the world to look at this and say, okay, $1 spent does $1 good in this issue, and $1 spent does $4 good here.
Mosquito nets might be better.
And the mosquito nets are going to be a much better expenditure because real people are going to be able to live, and maybe that real person is the person who invents this magical technology of nuclear power we're all dreaming for. I
agree on all these points so far, but I want to swing back because you said you want the government not involved at all.
Yes.
Now, do you not want the government involved in any type of environmental policy or just with global warming? Like, are you okay with the Clean Air Act?
Parts of the Clean Air Act are fine. I think there's good to have basic environmental standards. I think protecting air and water are good. I think global warming is a little bit of a different issue, but there are a lot of things that you can do. I would not want an EPA. I would rather not have it done through a giant agency. I'd rather have it be part of another agency.
And weirdly, me being, I have fairly good credentials as a classical liberal and not a big government guy. I see the rationale for it because pollution doesn't go up. Well, we're at the edge of Kansas. We got to stop now because that's a different jurisdiction. So I see the need for there being some sort of federal arbitration going on. I would probably handle it more towards property rights and that kind of thing. The carbon tax, in my mind, is a way of circumnavigating a lot of those red tape regulations and just going, look, we're just going to tax you, and you're going to end up paying for the externalities as opposed to having a micromanagement. But I do see the need for there being something to adjudicate disputes if there's a river between Kansas and Oklahoma Oklahoma and Kansas or something like that. I see the need for it.
I'm not saying, of course, there are certain needs for some of these things. I think we come up with a bunch of examples where you could come up with it. I think the less, the better. Right, so I think for me at least,
and carbon tax. I'm going to just reason to get behind the carbon tax.
Okay.
A lot of the Clean Air Act would become redundant at that point. So you actually could get rid of some of the existing labyrinthine regulations and go, we're basically just you're paying for the externality, and because of that, we're anticipating you lessening that externality as opposed to having all of these regulations dictate how to go about doing it.
Yeah, and I think I think there's an argument to be made. And I would agree with this argument in that if you're going to have a giant government, and I would classify it as a giant government tax on carbon, or a way to restrict carbon. If we're going to be in this world where government isn't intervening, I think the carbon tax is the best of those options.
Okay.
Right. So because it's pure, right? It's like, hey, you're using this and you got to pay for it. There's not a lot of gaming. Cap and trade, I think, is the opposite of that. I think it winds up being, there's a lot of gaming that goes along with that. I think a pure carbon tax is the best approach. Because what you're trying to do is, taxes work. Taxes will decrease whatever activity you're taxing. Yeah. It's actually really, generally speaking, works really well. I don't like it most of the time. And I think when you're talking about taxing something that is essentially a marker of the economy and of growth and of civilization, right? I think CO2 emissions would track remarkably well if you wanted to just close your eyes and draw a line of how good have things got in the world from the year zero to today. Carbon emissions would track incredibly well with that.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I think carbon emissions are a negative externality of something really positive, right?
Yes. Economic growth is good.
Is really good.
Technology is good.
There's a lot of the carbon tax. As you're talking about this, first of all, I think if you support a carbon tax, and I'd like to get your thought on this, I think if you support a carbon tax, you need to support a global carbon tax. Which means getting involved with a lot of different things that I'm uncomfortable with when it comes to essentially a global governance system. And I don't mean that from a New World Order spooky, conspiracy way. I just mean that there's a system, essentially whatever it is through the UN, that is actually the one applying the tax. Because it's, again, we talked about those emission numbers. You can take our emissions down to zero, and within 10 to 15 years, the rest of the countries on the globe are going to increase.
Right.
And I think there's this rationale of, we are the ones that polluted first, and we're the ones that got all the benefits of CO2 emissions, and we can't talk about these other countries like China and India. And China by far is the largest emitter of CO2 in the world. And we can't talk about that because, they didn't have the runway.
Per person, Australia's got more carbon than we do.
Yeah,
and it's also fatter than us per person.
Yes.
So when everybody makes fun of us, Australia's more us than us.
Weren't you an ambassador from a small area?
That has now lapsed, but I was a diplomat on behalf of Hutt River, of which I am still a citizen, which is a small 70-kilometer area inside of Western Australia.
Yes.
That will eventually be recognized by the United States government, I'm confident.
There's no question about that. And that's really what we should be spending our time talking about.
With the carbon tax, a few responses to that. One thing that I think, you bring up the punitive element of it, which is true. It's an incentive system, right? Basically, a carbon tax is predicated on the idea that the private sector knows how to innovate better than the government. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to incentivize the private sector to move in a direction. That's true. However, I'll add to that it is also endeavoring to take into account the externalities of carbon into the price of it. So if I'm down the street from a coal factory and my neighborhood is, and we're all getting sick and we're having to go to the hospital, then it's not the get off carbon is one thing, but also just that is a negative thing that needs to be paid for by someone. So I think that a carbon tax in some ways is more accurately reflecting the overall cost of that form of energy production when compared to, say, like wind or solar power or natural gas or something like that. The final thing I'll say is I would not be in favor of a global carbon tax because I assume that the UN is going to be in charge of that, and I don't want the UN. I mean, as of now, the most powerful person at the UN is whoever sets the prices at the gift shop. So I'm not really sure how they would get to that point. I would not be okay with I would see that being a labyrinthine mess. I think that in order to implement a carbon tax, you'd have to be careful of two different things. I think you'd, one, have to make sure that you set it at an appropriate amount to where it's not going to drive business away. I mentioned this to Jerry Taylor yesterday. I don't know the ins and outs of this. He thought that whatever their proposed rate is, you'd see maybe 4 to 5% of businesses affected leaving, but it would be fairly low of a threshold. However, I'll say with any type of environmental regulation, there's almost a Laffer curve that you've got to be cognizant of, because if I am in Texas and I go, we jack up the carbon tax, 400% or something, and then the businesses just go south in Mexico, we've now lost that business, and they're going to be producing just as much carbon. So it's
and we know
two bad things, right?
If you raise taxes on these businesses, they will go. I mean, not all of them. Not all of them will be able to go. But many of them will go, just like we're seeing with tariffs today.
Some of them will. So you got to be careful. And then I'd say that the other thing is you probably have to have some kind of border adjustment going on, which like loath as I am to implement tariffs, you'd have something like that, or it might reflect more like when I fly into England or Scotland, my air bill, jumps by $200 because they've got taxes there. Well, there's nothing I can do about that because I have to get into that country. But whatever company's operating from there is taxed upon coming into it. There's certain border ways to handle that, I think, without going to a global government.
But I think your argument against the global government thing is it's going to be a mess, right? Like the UN handling something, they're incompetent. But you have faith in the U.S. government to implement this tax policy and a new tariff policy to balance all of this out. I do not have the same faith that you do.
Oh my God, you're playing into my skepticism of government. Oh,
it's true.
Stu comes over the right hook. Wow.
Well, and I think too, and that's why I think the only way you can do it is, to me, a global tax, which I am just not in favor for a million different reasons. Because a ton of CO2 in China is a ton of CO2 here. It's the same effect. And you go, and by the way, we should all acknowledge that China has been lying about how much they've been emitting for a very long time. In fact, for many years, we thought we were the top emitter and realized that for a long time we had not been, because we did not have the truth from China, and that's just one country. Again, think of yourself as a country that is in the middle of trying to feed its people and dealing with maybe internal strife. The last thing in the world you're doing is counting CO2 emissions accurately. So the system as a whole, to me, it's almost, I feel like almost unfair to come on the program and tell you that I think this would be inefficient, because I know you know this. It would be, I think, a complete disaster and get gamed in a million different ways.
Let's say though that it winds up being the equivalent of 30 cents extra when you're filling up your car. That it's a low level thing. What I do think you'd see is, I think you'd see consultancy firms pop up that would go, hey, like, we can come talk to you about how to lower your carbon footprint. You'd see potentially more competition happening between things that aren't subject to carbon, like maybe not natural gas, but like solar power, wind power, nuclear power, that kind of thing. So I think you could see a more competitive energy sector, and you could see more innovation in terms of just figuring out ways to lessen carbon. So there would be positive things coming out of it. It's not just the draconian element; it's also this figuring out ways to lessen it and move away.
No, but I think this is true about everything, right? Like you could take any market. If we decide, hey, we really need someone to create a carbonated whiskey, and we want to make a $100,000 X Prize, or we're going to tax every whiskey that isn't carbonated. I guess you would see innovation, but again, that's the government trying to force it. And is the government efficient at doing this? And I think we know over a long period of time, the answer to that is no. I think what you're arguing for is already occurring. We've seen drops by over 90% when it comes to generating power through solar panels. We've seen what we haven't seen innovation like this, unfortunately, is nuclear power, because that's been in the way. But those ideas are there and ready to be fully developed as soon as we would unleash them. I think you see a situation where these improvements largely are occurring anyway because people have decided that they think that they're important. People have decided in the free market on their own volition that these things are important. You're right, there are some big sort of projects that people will argue you need the intervention. I would definitely argue that you don't, but I'll give you a good example of this. The carbon tax rate, they've gone 1 million studies to figure out what do we need to do to actually limit the damage of global warming, keeping it under 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees or a really more restrictive area. And the carbon tax per ton ranges from $20 per ton to $27,000 per ton. So it's obviously a really wide range, but the number they land on is about $140 per ton, which is a lot. I mean, it would be noticeable. It's not a few cents extra here and there. It's a noticeable change in the economy. It would cost a lot. These are things that we use all the time. But right now, there are companies that can do carbon capture for $100 a ton. So we are already at a time in which we can capture carbon, which is a very early part of that technology, for less than what they say the needed tax is. And that's without a massive infrastructure globally from the UN or even here in the United States, which, again, I would argue, the United States, even when implemented and even if it cut down carbon in massive ways, would not actually lead to any sort of real noticeable reduction.
So you're saying at that point, why not just build the carbon capture as opposed to have the carbon tax?
Carbon capture is getting to the point already. And carbon capture is a terrible example of this because it's very early on. But I'm using it intentionally because it's like this isn't even like we don't even have to get rid of oil, right? We don't even have to get rid of gas. Like these are things where fossil fuels can be burned and captured and stored so they don't get into the atmosphere. And that is all. I mean, the technology is there. It's been there for a long time. It hasn't been efficient enough monetarily to do. But now we're down under the price that the people who are saying a tax is necessary. It's less than that to go to carbon capture. And the argument here would be like, well, if we implement the tax, then everyone will go to carbon capture. And that may actually occur, may be true. But I don't think you need to force it, and think of the negative externalities that come out of that system. We're not going to go through, this is not going to be this thing where we go in there and it runs as smoothly as the post office even. Like this is going to be a massive money infusion. It's going to be something that they're never going to want to lose. I don't care if you solve global warming completely, they're never going to want to lose that tax. They'll figure out a way to transfer it to someone else. It will be money they depend on. It will grow government and it will lessen our freedom. So I think from a moral sort of like philosophical viewpoint, I oppose it from there, but I do not think it would be effective anyway. Well, I do think it's better than the other options.
Because we're coming up towards the end of the program then.
God, I've been blabbing for a long time.
No, this is good. This was a good chat. Mm-hmm. So then, the ultimate Stu position is that global warming is happening. We're probably contributing to it, but we shouldn't do anything about it on a government level. There's no actual policy prescription that you would advocate?
I do not believe we should act on that. I mean, other than the idea of freeing up innovation, there's a lot of things I would argue for in every world to be able to lower the burden on businesses and such. But I mean, again, I think you take a step back and say, what do you hear from people who are advocating, for these policies in general? And again, I don't want to broadly generalize, but I mean, I have to at some level.
Yeah.
The idea is that this is a huge problem. And not that it's a huge problem in 100 years or 200 years, but it's happening right now. We're seeing massive problems with it. And there are people who make arguments about all sorts of things that are caused by global warming. There's thousands. We should do a thing on Wonderful World of Stu here. Another 10 things blamed on global warming, which is like just this list of crazy things that they'll blame on them. And let's say all of them are true. Take the entire package. Like when we are going to get punished with a carbon tax because we polluted first and China didn't, well, what did China get out of that? China is not. If we're going to pay for our sins, we should also be rewarded for our good deeds. And if you step back and look at the past, 100 years of human history, I think when you got to CO2 levels rising, you'd get way down the list, past a lot of other really good things before you got to that. Yes, CO2 has risen. Yes, we've seen some warming. Yes, there are some concerns, I think, going forward, but what we've been able to accomplish by burning that carbon has far outweighed the negatives about it. And I think we should look at that as a package and say, okay, those two things there might be some negatives. It's a trade-off. There might be some negatives that go along with our economic development, but we've ripped 2 billion people out of poverty here.
Oh yeah, that's good. And so final thought and final question, then we'll kick it off, and then I've got to let you go, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. The first one is I agree with you in that I don't want to develop a policy based on emotional punishment. Yes. We have sinned and therefore we should pay for it. I don't think that that's a good way to have a national policy at all. That said, though, it sounds like you're, I think, being as generous as I can on your side of the argument. It's that innovation is the best bet to outpace the trouble that might happen. Now, if that's the case, is there a point at which things could get bad enough that you would want to have some sort of government intervention, or would you always want to just try and step back and have is there a threshold point at which you'd go, okay, things are really getting, the polar bears have eaten all the Eskimos, we got to step in and do something?
When it comes to, you're limiting these options to government, and I think I can't think of a situation off the top of my head, at least, where government is going to be the most efficient way to do this. I think, maybe, is there an argument where you can say we prioritize it nationally and, reward certain behaviors, whether it's with its incentives and things of that nature? I don't know. You're kind of giving me a hypothetical situation that basically seems like the sun's about to crash into the earth. Should we put up a wall against it? Well, yeah, probably. I think government intervention, largely would probably go into the form of, first of all, as limited as possible. Secondly, I think adaptation is a important part of this. We build seawalls when Galveston got hit by a hurricane, the whole thing went underwater. Almost everyone died. They built a big seawall about it. Now everyone lives there, right? These are most of the things we talk about here. And this comes to hurricanes and tornadoes and all of these other things, which, by the way, in drought even, which have shown decreases over long term. The trends are down for these things actually happening, and certainly way down when it comes to actually killing people and affecting people's lives.
Although that's because we've adapted, not because the actual storm amounts are going down.
The actual number of storm amounts are down. The actual number of tornadoes are down. The actual number of global drought is down. I actually that's the one thing I actually printed out here. Allow me to read to Andrew here.
So my understanding is, is that we are having more volatile storms. However, our ability to not die in them has got much better. So the mortality rate is down. Even if it was
just that, I think it would be a good outcome. Okay?
Sure, less dead people's good.
End stop, right? A period. Yes, less people dying. It would be a good outcome, and that carbon was well worth it if this was all completely true. But let me give you these. These are from, various. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences. This is a climate science special report. Analysis of global and continental scale trends indicates that drought severity and other statistics have actually declined. Within the existing literature, few locations show statistically significant changes in flooding, nor have they been linked to precipitation or temperature. There is some evidence of upward trends in precipitation extremes, but essentially none in floods. U.S. drought has decreased over more than a century. We have cyclones in the South China Sea, making landfall in China and Vietnam, have declined over the past 65 years. What we've seen in tornadoes and in drought in the U.S., in flooding, in hurricanes, have all been slight negative trends. Now, that doesn't mean that we should put more climate in to lower the amount of storms.
Keep in mind that deglaciation is still happening, and while regionally it'll increase, overall it's decreasing. I think 90% of the glaciers are shrinking, so that's bad.
It is bad. That's not to say that
the acidity of the ocean's increasing, biodiversity is going down because the rate of extinction is much higher than it was. It's up by about 100% from.
And again, I know you're towards the end of your show, so I don't want to get into too many rants here. I think it's not to say that there are no changes that are negative. I'm not arguing for more global warming. I'm not on here saying, the UN IPCC report, and this is a little bit of a weird way to look at it, but when it comes to a straight cost-benefit analysis sort of view, a little warming isn't bad for us, right? Over the next about 80 years, probably be
assuming
positive.
It doesn't release a giant pocket of methane in Antarctica, and then all of a sudden the sea levels just jump by.
Now you're getting into a positive versus negative feedback conversation, and I know that's exactly what your audience wants 45 minutes into this, so I will leave it out of that. But I do understand. Look, I'm not saying there's no risks. I'm not saying there's no negatives. I think there are. I'm not going to come in here and say, well, it's wonderful, and we should just argue to put more CO2 out there because it helps plants grow, which it does, but that doesn't mean we should start doing that. I think you have to look at the whole thing. Alarmism, which is a word I think gets thrown around a lot here, it does apply here, and I think it's okay for someone who's scared about global warming to say, "Hey, we got to raise the alarms," and it's a real thing. However, we can look at these things and say, almost all the time it's not real, and almost all the time we solve them. Almost every single time we come up with a way to do this. And it's largely done not by governments, but by people innovating on their own. And I think that as we go here, we're already at the point that all these technologies exist. We're just talking about cost levels. At some point, and I think it's relatively soon, we talked to the futurist Ray Kurzweil, who thinks it's about 2030, that we'll get to a point where a solar panel will be so cheap and so effective that we won't even have this conversation anymore. The idea of thinking about how to deal with carbon will be insane because it will be so effective by 2030. I don't know. He's a futurist. Maybe he's a little optimistic on that. But I think we are nearing a point and where LED lights are a great example of this. Fluorescent lights sucked and everyone wanted to dive into it. LED lights are better than regular incandescent lights. Now, the government did essentially ban incandescent lights, but LED lights would have worked. They would have, regardless of whether they had done that or not, LED lights would have taken off because they're better, they're more efficient, they cost much less to run. And at some point, you become an idiot for holding on to the old way because it's more beneficial to you to go to the new way. And I think that is what will happen. I think it's already happening. And I think the more of a foothold you give the government into this process, you slow that capacity most likely because they'll probably pick the wrong winner or loser. But beyond that, you also will get a situation that you will not be able to unwind it afterwards. You'll solve this problem and you'll be dealing with this thing hanging over your head and over the economy's head for multiple centuries to come. And I just don't think it's worth the cost.
Okay. Well, we'll end on that. Stu, I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for coming out. What a pleasant conversation that was.
It was a pleasant conversation.
I wish that I brought more sticky notes myself.
I know, I did have a couple on
you
there.
got some really good swings there at the end. Well, but I enjoyed having you on. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do believe you should be supplying people with carbonated whiskey.
Oh, yes. I think we can all agree that carbonated whiskey, if that should certainly be exempt from any type of taxes. Yes. Little bit of listener feedback before we wrap up this episode. On iTunes, Stephanie says, been a fan of Andrew since high school. I was lucky enough to get to read his articles in our college newspaper as well. His podcast is a delight and also incredibly informative. I truly enjoy listening. Wow. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much. I think that this person's probably changed their name because I didn't recognize the surname, so I assume that she's married now. But if you're who I think you are, thank you. And if you're somebody that I'm not, you know what? Stephanie, thank you. That was a very kind thing to say. I appreciate that. Reach out to me on Facebook. You can watch this whole show on YouTube. If you look for Something's Off with Andrew Heaton, you can see my handsome bearded face and assortment of suits and the dead bison head we screwed to the wall. Watching Something's Off with Andrew Heaton on your computer will only make you seem more sophisticated and amusing at your office. In fact, if you get caught watching it when you're supposed to be finishing up those TPS reports, you'll probably actually get a raise. So go to YouTube and start watching full episodes. I look like Mr. Rogers from The Shoes Down. I don't know what The Shoes Down means, but I bet you that's clever. Jennings is a clever guy. Remember, you can always tweet me at Mighty Heaton or Facebook me at facebook.com/Mighty Heaton, or even email me by subscribing to my newsletter and just replying when I send it out. Finally, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. That helps other people discover this here political orphanage. Thank you, and good day.